Today on Pilgrim Radio's His People, Katie Gaddini on how Christian women empower the conservative movement.
A lot of women see themselves as these modern-day Esthers, and they similarly see themselves as involved in a battle to save the nation, especially the nation's children, from the left, from woke indoctrination, as they call it, and they relate the modern-day contemporary political and cultural happenings through an Old Testament and a Christian lens to make sense of it. So that is very much making sense of their whole world and also powering and fueling their politics.
Katie Gaddini next. In her book, Esther's Army, The Christian Women Who Powered the American Right, sociology professor Dr. Katie Gaddini discusses highlights of 10 years of research into the role conservative Christian women have played in building and sustaining the American political right. Although Dr. Gaddini doesn't personally share the beliefs of many of her subjects, she nonetheless sought to understand their views and motivations. Here's Spencer Dahlke.
What prompted you to write the book? What piqued your interest in this topic?
Yeah. So I grew up an evangelical. My dad was a pastor. There are 4 other pastors in my family. And I, like so many evangelicals, also aligned with the Republican Party. That was the party I registered with when it came time to vote. And I didn't really think twice about it. As I got older and as I moved abroad, I changed my political affiliation and changed my denomination as well. Even though I still call myself a Christian, I'm no longer an evangelical in that sense. So it's always been interesting to me, the relationship between faith and politics in the United States. It's a really particular relationship. And it was something that I really wanted to study to kind of understand my own background, but also just to understand more the way that it occurs in the United States. And so when Trump was announced as the Republican nominee, he was such an outsider candidate for so many people, myself included. That was an opportunity to really understand this phenomenon of Christianity and politics in America. It was the perfect time, I thought, to really dive into it.
I understand this has been a project you've been working on for like almost a decade, since obviously, 2 terms, not consecutive. So what did that process look like a little bit for you, and how did you find some of the people you talked to?
So I started the project when I was still doing my PhD and I was living in England at the time. So that meant taking trips back to the United States and doing interviews. And then around 2022, that's when I decided I really needed to be in the country full time to be doing this research. So I moved my husband over to the United States and I started doing more on the ground research. So that meant going to rallies, town hall events, church services, a lot of church classes on politics that were happening around the time, Bible study group, prayer nights, and then a lot of events that you wouldn't consider necessarily Christian events. Like I did ping pong clubs in the church basements. I went to rallies at capitals that were organized by Christian groups. I really wanted to get the spread of the way that Christian women were organizing politically and thinking about politics. And I followed that through right up until the 2024 election. I did a few follow-up interviews in 2025. And as you mentioned, that brings us to 9 years worth of research. So in that time, I was able to cover the 3 presidential elections, but also other major political events such as the pandemic, which had a huge impact on our country, Joe Biden winning that election in the middle there, the assassination attempts on Donald Trump, the killing of Charlie Kirk, all these major political events. I was able to kind of tap in and re-interview women during those times to find out how they were thinking about current events.
Like you mentioned, actually, before the interview, I was commenting on, probably some of our listeners are conservative, and you asked what kind of conservative. So I'm curious, you're talking about the Christian women that power the American right. Seems like it could be a vague term. How are you understanding that term, and what does that spread look like?
So I want to be really clear first and foremost that this is not a study of Republican women. And that sometimes gets mistaken, I've noticed at book events. A lot of the women in my study do not identify as Republican. They might be independent. They might toggle back and forth between independent, Republican, but their allegiance is much more to conservatism and Christian conservatism. Oftentimes their allegiance is more to the MAGA movement than it is to a political party. And that's a shift that we've seen in the United States over the past decade, this sort of moving away from the two-party identifications and a lot more people identifying as independent. I also use the term Christian more holistically. So I started the study looking just at evangelicals, and I found over time that that was way too limiting. I would go to events where a woman would speak, let's say a town hall event, and I would say, okay, she's definitely an evangelical. So I'd ask her if we could meet for an interview. Then I would interview her, and it turns out she's a Catholic. Several women in my study converted from evangelicalism to Catholicism. There were some mainline Protestants in the study. Basically, even with my own really deep knowledge of denominational differences, I often couldn't tell the difference because they were so much more devoted to their political project than to their denominational camps. So I use conservative more holistically and I use Christian more holistically. I know there's downsides to this sorts of keeping it broad, but I found that was the truest way to capture the women that I met that were involved in political organizing.
You describe over the course of your book a number of archetypes, I guess, that you were looking into. Would you, tell us about those?
When you do 9 years worth of research, and I wasn't just doing ethnography and interviews, I was also doing archival research, social media analysis. I had a lot of data, and I needed to find a way to organize this data in a way that would be readable for a book. So I saw these clear patterns arising with different types of women. And that's not to say these are mutually exclusive categories. You can certainly be more than one type, but I saw there was a distinct thing happening with college women, for example. There was a distinct form of politics happening with Black Christian women. I have mama bears. That was a really big and prominent pattern in my research with women who identified as mama bears and were politicking as mothers and protecting their kids. I have social media influencers in the book because they're also doing their own thing, even though they might have the same shared goals and issues that they care about. White suburbanite women also is a distinct category in my book. And then I have powerhouses, and these were the women that ran for office or held office or had really prominent leadership roles that kind of sets them apart as well because they were much more involved in the institution and the Republican Party.
I appreciated how, I think, as I was looking at your introduction, you mentioned that, one of the easy explanations for the way that women on the right are activated is just power dynamics. Yeah, the easy explanation that a lot of people turn to, and at least it seemed to me that wasn't just immediately the jump that you made you made as well. What other forces are at play that are, use the term, activating these women?
One of the major moments, I call it a watershed moment, is the pandemic. And I think as scholars and journalists as well, we haven't analyzed and appreciated enough how much of an impact the pandemic had on politics in the United States. So many of the women I met said that 2020 was this turning point for them. Their eyes were opened. They were red-pilled. They saw that there was government interference. There were sort of evil spirits at work when it came to their children. The mask mandates, social distancing, the vaccine mandates in states like we have here in California that was proposed, that switched a light on for a lot of women, and they became interested in politics and more active in politics than they ever had before. And what's interesting is they're not going back. They're not going back to kind of who they were or how they engaged with politics before. They are now in the fray. And that moment really comes down to the 2020-2021 pandemic response by the government and the media and mainstream institutions.
What do you think it was about the government response that was triggering, I guess?
To be fair, there was really uneven reporting around the pandemic. I was in the UK at the time. We had the same thing going on there. Journalists couldn't make sense of what was happening. No one knew what was happening. The reporting that was being shared was unstable, uneven, at times inaccurate. That caused people to lose trust in the mainstream media. When you look at polls now in 2026, that trust has not gone up. especially for conservatives, the trust in the mainstream media is as low as it was in 2020. It has not gone up to pre-pandemic levels. So that was an irrevocable erosion of trust. Same thing for mainstream institutions in the United States. Let's take the Department of Health, Fauci. There's been a lot of criticism about him at the time. Regulations that were put forward in the name of science that, again, might not have had a lot of evidence behind them. The vaccine that was brand new, that was being put forward, people lost trust because they felt that they were being experimented on. They felt that they were being lied to in some cases, and that trust just hasn't come back. And that has led to conspiracy theories in some cases, and it's led to the seeking of an alternative way of getting information and an alternative way of doing politics.
Alternative way of doing politics, you say? Tell us more about that. What does that look like?
I mean, Donald Trump is an alternative way of doing politics in a lot of ways. And that's, I think, what a lot of people are drawn to about him is that he is outside the box. He doesn't do business as usual in a lot of ways. But it also meant, women wanting to get on the school boards and having very strategic strategies for how to get on the school board and how to influence school policy. That was an alternative way to what they did before. Whereas before, maybe they would vote when there was a presidential election. Now they are getting more involved, and they're getting involved in different ways than they did before. They're not just talking about political issues with their fellow homeschool moms or their Bible study friends. They are out there marching, or they are out there developing a new homeschool curriculum. In some cases, I've seen that happen. So they're thinking outside the box when it comes to their political engagement. I've seen a lot of women and families move from the communities that they were living in, had lived in for decades. They're moving to red states, or they're moving to more rural red communities because they want a change. So these are very big decisions to make. And I'm not saying it all comes down to the pandemic, but that was a factor in the shift that we've seen.
Obviously, your book is about these women who are powering the American right, is what you call it. I mean, I would take that and assume the idea there, I suppose, and is that these women that you describe are turning the flywheel, shall we say, to carry these things forward. Are there ways that you studied and observed that they do that uniquely that, shall we say, maybe men aren't doing?
Yeah, certainly. I bring history into the book to show the way that women's involvement in the Christian right has changed and not changed over time. And I take my starting point as 1970 because that's when a lot of Christian right institutions started to develop, organizing started to develop more formally. And what I found is that women back then, by and large, were much more in the background. So I was able to do interviews with women who worked for the Reagan administration, for example. They worked really high up in the administration. They were drafting legislature that is still in effect today, but people don't know their names. And so, in effect, they were these sort of part of the engine of the Christian right, but they didn't have recognition. They didn't necessarily even want it. They just wanted to get the job done. That's the words that they use. Whereas women today have a much more front and center role. So if we look at the women that Trump appointed to his cabinet when he took over in 2024, there were a lot more women than is customary for a Republican candidate, not compared to a Democratic candidate, but for Republican. His chief of staff is a woman. He had, now some of them have left their positions, but he had a lot of women in prominent positions. And that's to say nothing of all the women I met who are in the background doing a lot of the on-the-ground work, organizing movements that are going to state capitals, that are gathering women together for political purposes to vote on certain issues or policy proposals, or indeed to try to get Trump reelected in 2024. So I see their role as very important and prominent. I think that they've moved much more from the background to the foreground. And I think that a lot of the accounting that's done on the MAGA movement, certainly in the contemporary moment, has not given enough attention to women's role in it.
Well, my guest today is Katie Gaddini. She's visiting scholar at Stanford University and associate professor of sociology at University College London and author of Esther's Army, The Christian Women Who Power the American Right. I've heard, I wouldn't be able to pinpoint exactly where, but that women on the whole tend to move left. The sample of Christians that you are examining, are they just exempt from that? Or is that, do you see that aligns or?
When we look at large scale national polling data, we find that Gen Z women, so the younger segment of women in particular, are the ones that are moving further left, and the Gen Z men on the whole are the ones moving further right. So that's where we have the split that is happening with the sort of left right. I want to nuance that because I think that that is a media headline that gets sort of popularized, and it becomes really easy to think like, oh, women on the left, men on the right. That's just like these static categories. Whereas, I did a lot of research with Gen Z women, college age women on the right who are aspiring to careers at the top echelons of DC power. So there are certainly women, young women on the right who are active, who are motivated, who are well trained, and who will become the future of the conservative movement. That being said, we're not seeing that sort of split happen in other age groups. And I think there's a few reasons for that. But the women I'm looking at, I studied women all the way from 18 years old. I think the oldest I interviewed was 76. So I wanted to show that conservative Christian women do span different categories and different age ranges, even though we have these sort of broader trends of the partisan split with the younger folks.
You were talking a little bit about issues that mobilize people a little earlier. I don't know, just revisiting the idea. Are there particular issues that you find in the course of your study were more mobilizing than others?
Yes. And this changed over time. Well, it did and it didn't. So in 2016, immigration was one of the top reasons that I found women were planning to vote for Trump. And that's the same in 2024, but the groups of immigrants that they were worried about changed. So in 2016, the groups that they were worried about were Muslims and Latin Americans. Whereas in 2024, Muslims never came up. I can't remember a single interview ahead of the 2024 election where a research participant mentioned Muslim immigration. It was all about the southern border and Latin Americans, and that was the perceived threat for them. So that issue has stayed the same, but also changed. The issue of trans rights, especially trans youth, that has been a major shift as well. So that was not mentioned in 2016 when I was doing interviews, whereas in 2024, it was one of the main issues across groups of women that I interviewed, that was a concern that they saw facing the United States. The economy was a major issue. It was much more of an issue for rural voters that I met and older women that had young children, for example. I say older, probably, a little bit older than me, whereas the Gen Z women weren't thinking as much about the economy. They were more thinking of culture, war issues. So the issues somewhat stayed the same, but we can also see differences across the population on what matters. And that also depends on where you live in the country, your age, if you have children or not, etc. So there's some consistency there, but there's also difference.
Our radio reach, I think, reaches Montana and Wyoming, Eastern California, Nevada. I'm kind of curious what you think are the issues that are most mobilizing, most important, might change based on areas. What did you observe about some of our reach?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. So I did do some interviews in that part of California and Nevada, certainly. I can't say I ever interviewed anyone in Wyoming. I did 28 states, but Wyoming was not one of them, sadly. Some of the issues, especially for the California, Nevada voters in that region that I saw concerns trans rights, especially when it comes to youth, not wanting there to be any regulations or policies in the schools where teachers can observe a student's pronouns and not tell the parents. They want parental rights. That was a major, major concern. In fact, I had someone in your part of California saying to me, this election is all about the kids. And that was about 2024. So that was the main one that I saw. Immigration as well, because of course in California, we're a border state. So that was something that was felt really strongly in California. Though to be fair, even in non-border states, even in Wisconsin, for example, I did some interviews there, they were feeling the concerns of immigration as well. How I would characterize it is that although the issue stayed the same across the regions, it was how pronounced it was. And certainly in California, some of the questions around school choice and youth and children and bathrooms, those were the top concerns I was seeing.
I suppose we probably could, break the idea of, right-wing conservatism. There's political conservatism, and then there's also like cultural conservatism, I suppose. What sort of figureheads are the leaders of the conservative movement among women, perhaps, since that's our subject?
So sometimes they would look to Christian leaders like Al Mueller, someone that they would take a lot of inspiration from. It was often women leaders. So this is where social media comes into play. Allie Beth Stuckey has had a major influence on the women I've met. Megyn Kelly has had a big influence. For some of the younger women, Alex Clark is someone they look toward. Candace Owens did have a big following with the women I met. I think towards the end of my research, she was falling out of favor with a lot of the women, especially since Charlie Kirk's assassination. So I think that's kind of shifted. So, it's a real mix of kind of straight Christian leaders and social media influencers who are Christians, but are doing most of their work on social media. And I saw that across the age groups.
What do you think is some of the most effective messaging that the conservative movement has put out?
I mean, if you look back at the 2024 election campaigns, there was that ad that the Trump side put out where it said, Harris is for they, them, and and Trump is for you. And I think, that just really sticks in my mind as such an effective message because it was basically communicating that the Harris campaign was so focused on pronouns and culture war issues, whereas Trump was concerned about the economy and livelihood and practical realities. And I think that ad really resonated with a lot of the women that I met. And especially because the economy was a huge motivating factor in that election. And then at the same time, we had a progressive Christian organization put out an ad about women in the voting booth, and Julia Roberts is doing the voiceover. And it's basically saying, Christian conservative women, you can do whatever you want in the voting booth. No one has to know. Like your husband and your pastor doesn't have to know. And the women I met found that incredibly condescending and degrading to assume that they didn't have minds of their own. So, I think you could do a whole study on just the ads and that campaign and how effective the Trump side was, at least the way it landed with the voters I met, and how it really seemed to speak to the realities and the everyday concerns that they had in the way that the Harris side didn't.
You're writing about Christian women that are powering the right. Is there something uniquely about Christianity that is informing and mobilizing these women?
Definitely. On the one hand, the women I met that have a more charismatic Christian denomination and outlook see that there is a battle happening in the spirit world. They believe that there are evil forces at play, and it's a battle between good and evil that is happening on a different plane, and that we're seeing the real world effects of that. And they want to be part of that fight. That's how they understand the world that they're living in. Even women who do not have a charismatic denomination see that there is a real battle going on. And that's why I have the word Esther in the title, because a lot of women see themselves as these modern day Esthers. And they similarly see themselves as involved in a battle to save the nation, especially the nation's children, from the left, from woke indoctrination, as they call it. And they relate the modern day contemporary political and cultural happenings through an Old Testament and a Christian lens to make sense of it. So that is very much making sense of their whole world and also powering and fueling their politics.
You mentioned, even that you grew up as an evangelical Christian, but have since, departed from the conservative movement. In what ways do you think Christianity and the conservative movement today are not aligned?
Yeah, there's significant pastors, groups, faith leaders in the country that are arguing for the disalignment, that are arguing that their faith, their Christian faith, leads them to a different form of politics. And I should add, when I left conservatism and I left the Republican Party, I left it through my faith. I was a very active churchgoer at the time, very involved in my church. And it was my faith and a different interpretation of my faith that led me to a different set of politics. So, the question of, does the faith come first or does the politics come first? For me, the faith came first, and that's what altered my politics. So I do think that the sort of fusion that's happened in the United States since the 70s of conservatism and the Republican Party with evangelicalism, I see places where it's loosening. I see places where there are different options for active and devout Christians to espouse a different set of politics, and there are faith leaders that are doing that work. And there's different countries where that's happening. I mean, the UK is a great example right now. Is the Church of England has made so many statements against the far right party that's been growing in that country. And priests and bishops have been coming out and saying our faith calls for this form of politics. And the same thing has happened with Germany, with the National Protestant Church, is a call for a different form of politics aligned with their faith. So I don't think that there is like something unique about the United States where our faith leads us to that form of politics. I think there's a loosening happening. And it's just been a really successful movement over the last 55 years in this country to say that the two are the natural and only fit.
What sort of momentum, I guess, have women brought to the conservative movement, and where do you think this momentum is taking the conservative movement over the next few years?
I will say two areas where I think women have been particularly impactful when it comes to conservatism in the contemporary era. So I'm talking about the MAGA movement. One is social media. So women, social media influencers, such as the ones I mentioned before, have been tremendously impactful. They have millions of followers. They have impact. And I know this because I've interviewed the women that follow them on social media. They have influenced how they think about political issues, how they engage with politics, if they engage with politics. I mean, the impact has been tremendous. The other area is moms, Christian moms who have gotten involved with politics under the authority of being mothers to speak out about issues that are important to them. And they're able to engage with political issues in a way that men just can't by virtue of the way that motherhood is valued and legitimized within Christianity. So those two groups have gathered a lot of momentum. I don't see them going away. I don't see the MAGA movement going away. This is a question I'm asked all the time. Like at this point, I think it will outlast Trump. I think that the movement has been really successful at building a wider coalition that we haven't seen before and pulling in voters that are typically at odds with the Republican Party. I'm not sure that that movement and that building is going to go away in the next couple of years.
You've been listening to His People on Pilgrim Radio. Many thanks to our guest, sociology professor Dr. Katie Gaddini, author of Esther's Army, the Christian Women Who Powered the American Right. On tomorrow's program, it's Steve Gardner on the past, present, and future of the land of Israel.
And Jesus used the land, the temple. Jerusalem is being trampled until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. So you get that, and that's in context of his second coming. Luke 21, Matthew 24. Those are all outlet discourse. Very linked, but it's land and people. It's not just one or the other.
That's tomorrow at the same time right here on His People. Thanks for listening.